Okay.
And that would be a yes, because I heard the echo. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be talking to you bright and early in an Australian morning and just before I gather your afternoon tea in Texas. So my apologies for not seeing you all in person, and a shout out to all the colleagues that I'm missing at this LAC. I hope it's going exceedingly well for you. From my colleagues who are there representing UniSA and the Centre for Change and Complexity in Learning, please note I have trashed all your offices. They look like crap now, and there is things everywhere. So welcome back when you get here. So just a quick little shout out to my colleagues here who worked on this paper, my good friend Abelardo Pardo, Fatima Salena Kia and Ernesto Panadero. I'm surrounding myself with too many Spanish folks at this point in time. I'm going to have to culturally diversify a little bit more. So we're going to be just talking a little bit about an integrated model of feedback and assessment, and in particular moving away from sort of, I guess, coarse-grained levels of assessment and moving towards more programmatic approaches. And the problem that sort of stimulated the idea around this was really, we've seen a lot of papers, in particular in learning analytics research, around self-regulated learning and individual areas around feedback, pushing towards personalised feedback or understanding feedback literacy, or even understanding the impact of particular types of feedback on student cohorts. Yet we really haven't seen a lot around the contextual factors that influence feedback and assessment. So it's an area there that we need to do a lot more work, and in particular how this is sequenced throughout a series of courses, if you like. So everyone has different terminologies, but a series of courses in a program, or what constitutes a degree. So from year 1, year 2, year 3 to year 4, if that's the case. And just to recognise the students' experience at a university is really, a course plays an important part, but ultimately it's the program that we're looking at. They graduate from a program and degree. And if you like to think of it, I'm very bad on analogies, so here's a poor analogy for you. If you think about it as a bunch of grapes, each grape is a part of the course structure, but ultimately it's the wine that comes out that would be their degree. Dwell on that. That's beautiful as you go into morning tea. Okay, just a little bit of background. So there's two phases of assessment. It's really whether or not we're assessing for learning or an assessment of learning, and that's really the dimension between formative and summative approaches there. Formative being the one that doesn't count to your final grade, and summative, it sums up to your final grade. So it's that feedback on progress or performance, which has really been a sort of an element we really don't do well. And I'm hoping that in our learning analytics research, we can actually start to address some of the aspects of assessment we do really poorly. We know that assessment drives particular study behaviour. If you think about instituting a quiz will drive certain surface approaches to learning, which is not necessarily a bad thing. If you have more complex assessment models, then that could drive a deep approach to learning, which again is not necessarily a good or bad thing. It depends on the context of which you're operating. But if you think about the quiz, then there's a lot of emphasis on the students' feedback literacy when all they receive is a quiz score. So what are they meant to do with that if they get, say, 7 out of 10 or 6 out of 10? And there's areas there that we can do better to build that feedback literacy, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. And we also know that assessment influences student motivation. And so that was a bit of work by Wormold, but basically indicating that the higher the allocation or the weighting on a particular assessment item, the more motivated students are to do it. So, which is not rocket science in that aspect. When we think about the program structures, largely, we don't think about programs overly well. We tend to have roles like program directors. I'm not sure what in the US the terminology would be there, but those who oversee the series of courses and help students navigate their way through the degree. Our assessment structures, though, are largely focused on a single course. And I do recognise, though, that there are many accredited programs, and I operate one in initial teacher education, where the quality assurance processes do look at specifically how the assessment works across multiple courses and how they address specific standards. But what they don't do is look at how the feedback builds through those processes. or how the assessment structures actually influence some of the type of feedback delivery mechanisms or what students are experienced through that process. And our assessment design, this is work by Ernesto has done in the past as well, is that the assessment design is really influenced by aspects of academic workload considerations and the class constraints. So while we may want to change our assessment, we often come back to and say, well, that's going to increase my marking, or I can't do that because it's a large class, or I can't do that even because of where the class is being held or the course is being held, whether it's online or whether it's in a blended model like this hybrid conference, or whether or not it's in a lecture theatre and it's very hard to do things like group work. So there are limited studies that really examine how an instructor's design choices have impacted on a program of study and the type of feedback that the student encounters. So for this study, we look at a different approach to how we can characterize assessments and feedback. We use a particular theoretical model there that's called MISCA. And we want to understand how feedback and assessment are enacted programmatically and the implications this may have for future learning analytics work. Just in feedback, and I'll just flag on that one, we do see contemporary models of feedback as it's a dialogic process, and while there are some debates around it's only feedback when it's actioned by a student or whether it's feedback as information that is provided to a student. We'd take the latter there, that it's information that's provided to a student. So a quiz is a form of feedback when you just get a score. We've long argued in learning analytics work that a need for personalised feedback, and we're starting to move into those spaces, particularly in the role of AI in education now, where we're getting a lot more detail. Feedback provision and research, though, is largely, to date, is focused on what occurs in a single course, which is not any different to a lot of learning analytics research, where it's sort of been the extraction of data in small-scale studies, detailed data, but small-scale studies, and we haven't expanded yet to very, very few large-scale institutional models or research studies on the impact of learning analytics. There's a bit of a lack of evidence at the moment of how feedback, and when we talk about feedback, how students experiences feedback and we develop their feedback literacy, how that is sequenced over a period of time within a program of study. And that's the big gap that we want to do and extend a little bit of a theoretical framing of a feedback model there. And so the one that we work off is, it's called MISCA. It was developed by Panadiria and Lipnovich with their reviewed 14 models of feedback to identify the similarities and differences and pose more of a holistic view of student feedback. The models were thematically classified into descriptive, internal processing, interactional, pedagogical, and the student characteristics. The final model is what they termed as MISCA: message, the implementation, the student, the context, and the agents. And importantly in this process, which you can see from the diagram, that MISCA represents positions student in the centre of the feedback process. The 5 elements, though, do represent the complexity of feedback and emphasise aspects such as the internal processing, so that cognitive motivation aspect, or the pedagogical intention of the feedback. Now, the model can be applied to individual feedback or feedback that occurs in a course of study, but there is a need for our learning analytics work to start to reflect the longitudinal dimensions of feedback in this process, and that is really tied to the assessment, whether it's formative or summative. And that can then enable a broader range of feedback that is aligned with the student developmental needs, that both in the short and longer term. Just to flag that MISCA is definitely not a linear process. So this one's, I'm going to blame Ernesto. It's a really shitty diagram, but it does flag that that there are interactions between these processes. So whether it's the feedback message interacting in a bidirectional process between the implementation, or it's unidirectional, where the feed from the feedback agents and the feedback message. So there's a lot more written there, and there's a sort of reference if people who want to delve a little bit more into MISCA. So the study we undertook was really a large-scale examination of personalised feedback. So we actually extracted data from a fantastic tool. If you haven't learned about it, you're really not in with the cool kids. It's called OnTask. And I think maybe my colleague Abelardo Pardo, who was the main lead on OnTask, he might be able to put that in the chat session so people can be amazed at what this tool can do. So if you don't have it, go and buy it. That's the short answer, and then you'll be with the cool kids. So anyway, we extracted information from OnTask, and we looked at, was implemented across a large institution. We'd also extracted our curriculum details from course and program management information, student learning outcomes, and obviously grades and other aspects and details that we could get our hands on. The data included the specific feedback messages, which is what we really wanted to investigate, how that feedback literacy was being framed over a period of time. So we undertook some text analysis then to classify the various conditions in the personalised feedback, what was being sent to students, and then looked at things like the regularity of those feedback messages, the timing of when they were sent, the specific content, the course assessment, the discipline that it was enacted in, the year levels, and ultimately student grades and whether or not high-performing students were receiving different information to other students in the class. So the results, which are all detailed explicitly in the paper, we did notice differences between disciplines, and this is largely an impact on really what is number 3. So how the course design really, and rightly so, needs to align with the assessment process. So courses such as, or disciplines such as biology and science, there was a very heavy reliance on testing. So their design of courses were very much around quizzes, exams, small tests, things like that. Not extensively, but more so than the other, that's all they did, but it was more so than other disciplines. Education, in contrast, had a heavy reliance on the written aspect. So they were looking at things like essays, reflections, things like assessment models like that. There was a difference in year levels, and for feedback messages, first year was very much on, dear student, please don't forget to submit your assignment, your submission, your date is coming up. And then also details on performance. In the latter years, the feedback did become more in-depth and was more what we might deem as actionable, how to improve your next steps. Obviously, learning design influences the actions there, but we did also notice there's a gap between sequencing of feedback and the assessment in a program of study, and that meaning that really how we scaffold feedback literacy and develop student understanding of what feedback means was not overly apparent across a sequence of courses. So meant to tie this back into what does this mean around MISCA? And MISCA is a really nice model there around sort of capturing the frameworks that influence how students understand feedback and how feedback is delivered. And the key thing there was that, well, it's really missing assessment was part of the model there. And assessment really drives a lot of those things around having an overarching impact on how it's delivered, the motivation for students, the feedback message itself, the context which it was driven. I'd also flag then it's how these courses then add up is really a part, and that's where we started to identify that the type of assessment, the discipline year level, also all had an influence on how students may start to see and interact. So feedback for us was really more like this, where it's a program of study and you have these individual courses that are all influenced by these different contextual factors that then feed into that sort of MISCA model. Some model of a meta model. So with our MISCA integration, just flag that the provision of feedback and the assessment practices themselves are important drivers of student learning in higher education. However, our academics instructors often view their work within the confines of a single course. And that often happens around, I made small changes to my course, which influences the design, which influences, again, how students perceive a particular type of feedback, which has more knock-on effects throughout a program of study. And that can result in more disconnected learning experiences, particularly around the concept of how we're delivering and providing feedback and what types of feedback a student experiences. And a more holistic perspective on feedback process is really needed, and that includes the examination of more program level feedback that is impacted not only by the assessment approaches, but also the learning context and the learning design of how things come together. The timing and content of feedback are shaped by the constraints of the course, so the design, student motivations, and other aspects there. I think as we move forward, learning analytics can definitely help shape how we examine feedback over multiple courses and start to tie that together, although that will require different data sets, and has been flagged all the way back to Ryan Baker's challenges for learning analytics. The ethics of those processes and gathering ethics in those processes is quite complex. So, but it is an area we do need to tackle, and we need to have those bigger data sets and tied data sets.
Do you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Yeah, just a brief interruption, because we're having an alert here, and we need to give some information to the people that are in the room, and then I will let you know. So we have like a tornado alert here in Texas.
Oh, okay. Stay safe.